my name is Stephanie Stillo, and I'm a curator in the Rare Books and Special Collections Division, and I am delighted to welcome you to another segment of From the Vaults. Today, we are joined by the Rare Books and Special Collections medievalist, Marianne Estelle.
Hi, thank you, Stephanie.
So today, we're going to talk about a collaboration that we find in the Airmount Library. And this collaboration was between the artist Pablo Picasso and the poet Pierre Reverdy. So during World War II, Reverdy composed a series of 40-some poems, and they came under the title of Les Chants des Morts, or the Song of the Dead. And the poems really reflect Reverdy's engagement with the international conflict and how he saw that unfolding around him. So they are a mixture of extreme despair, but also hopeful optimism. So in 1948, Pablo Picasso created a series of original lithographs to accompany Reverdy's poems. But instead of doing a literal translation or visual elaboration on Reverdy's poetry, he instead created an abstract visual language that latticed through the poetry. So to talk about this unique visual language that Picasso created for Reverdy's poems, we're going to talk more with Marianne Estelle. So Marianne, there's a great deal of debate about why Picasso illustrated this particular text in this particular way. But one of the prevailing theories is that he was influenced by medieval manuscripts. So as a medievalist, what are some of the visual echoes of medieval manuscripts that you see in Picasso's work?
Well, medievalists have a tendency to see echoes of medieval manuscripts everywhere, but I think in this case we're justified. The publisher, Thiriade, was very interested in creating what he called a modern manuscript. And that was this ability to take a famous artist like Picasso or Matisse or Rouault and mix the words with the images in a particular way that was inspired by medieval manuscripts. And I think of his collaborative works, the Song of the Dead really stands out because of some of the decisions that, in particular, Picasso made. And so one of the wonderful things about being at the Library of Congress is how deep the collections go. And so we were able to pull some medieval manuscripts here, 15th century manuscripts.
An impressive one as
Absolutely.
well.
To kind of continue the conversation that the author and the illustrator had. All right, so the first thing I want to draw your attention to is the size of this work. The modern manuscripts tended to be in this folio size, which adds a kind of presence to the creation. You're not going to slip this in your pocket and take it on your metro ride into work. This is something you're going to deliberately maybe sit down with or stand, and it needs to be held. And so we picked as a pairing this 15th century gradual, which would have been used in a liturgical setting. Obviously, this needs to be held up, and it would have been available so that a choir could have sung in front of it. And we wanted to draw attention to just how large and impressive this work is in size, but also in the dynamics of the script and the color that's used. Because the color is what converses with history more than anything else. So traditionally, medieval manuscripts are created with, if you're only going to pick one color, it would be this vibrant red. Mm-hmm. So this red is called rubrication in manuscript studies, and it comes from the Latin word rubrica, which means red. And it's the word we use as the basis of our word rubric. Perfect. So that's where we got that from. And if you'll notice this 15th century German manuscript on your left, there are little red lines, and the first letter of many of the sections uses a very similar color. And intentionally or not, Picasso's work goes back and references the rubrication of earlier manuscripts.
It's very interesting because we have seen other artist books in or livres d'artistes that are in the Aramount Library that use a similar red as well. So earlier we talked in one of our segments about Georges Rouault and his particular illustrations for Cirque, and he used a very specific red also because it was the red of old books. So a very similar and nice connection there.
And we do know that Picasso at least saw one manuscript in a rare book shop in Paris because his partner at the time attests to it. So we do know that he at least interacted with them minimally, though how much and exactly what, we can't quite say.
Okay. All right, well that was incredibly fascinating, but as someone that studies medieval manuscripts, you surely see differences also between what Picasso has done and what you see in manuscript production. So tell us about some of those differences as well.
Excellent. Yes, this is when it helps to have an older piece right next to it. So one of the differences would be kind of from a medieval aesthetic. This would be considered maybe a less expensive manuscript. It has the hallmarks of something that would be created with a little bit more roughness. And so the first thing we notice is that this is on paper rather than parchment, and parchment would have been a more luxury item. It also has no proper illumination. So technically speaking, illumination refers to the gold leaf that you see here. And so where this might have what's called penwork, Picasso's brushstrokes are rough. And that roughness would have been difficult to see this as a luxury item in the 15th century for a 15th century audience. The other real point of departure for the modern manuscript is in the script. So it was very important to Thériault, the publisher, that these modern manuscripts be in the hand of the artist or the poet. So in this case, it's Reverdy's hand. And you'll notice here, there's a cross out, and more is written at the top. And so for medieval studies, this would be considered a scribal error. Scribes were not the authors. Their scribes were very well trained, and it was a professional job, and you were often just a copyist. And so you'll notice these letters are very uniform. And this would be scribbling in your notebook, would not have been something that you would then illuminate. This would have, on the other hand, for the contemporary audience in a modern setting, this brings us closer to what we think of as being an authentic moment of genius for the artist. And so we're looking for that kind of intimate engagement with a moment of artistic genius. This is looking for a kind of technical perfection. And so you have two different artistic aims here that I think is very important because it tells you something about the culture in which they're created.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting that you bring up Thériault as well, because you're right that several of the publications that come from him do have that handwriting. So you think immediately of one of the most famous livres d'artistes, which is Jazz, right? That is famously in Matisse's handwriting. All right, so sort of a larger question of why do you think Picasso decided to illustrate Reverdy's poetry in this particular way? So he was notorious about having very different levels of engagement with the text that he was illustrating. He and Reverdy were, of course, friends, and so I don't know if that came into it, but what do you think is Picasso's engagement here between the illustration and the text?
Well, so Picasso made more lithographs for this book than he did for any other. And so he was certainly invested in it to a certain extent, though with Picasso, I certainly couldn't speak for him. My impression is that his engagement with the text also has a bit of a historical point of conversation, in that I think Picasso, like the medieval period, recognized the flexibility of abstraction. And with the medieval period, you often have border illustrations, or you have like these lovely initials that make use of lines and designs. And Picasso is able to, he certainly abstracts them more, kind of takes them apart and layers them on the page. But both the medieval period and Picasso's drawings allow the reader to engage with the text and bring their own thoughts to it without being catechized. So Picasso's illustrations are not really illustrations in the sense that they're not pictorial and they don't tell you how to interpret the text. They allow you to bring your experience to the illustrations and let the movement of the border designs bring you through the poetry.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about that the poetry itself has a bit of abstraction to it as well, right? So there's sort of several layers of interpretation that you could engage with in this particular work, which is really interesting to think about.
I think so.
Yeah. So as a way of sort of wrapping up, everyone sees Picasso through their own particular lens. So through your study in the medieval period, what do you see with Picasso and his brushwork here?
Thank you for asking. I feel like Picasso is such a complicated artist that everybody has their own way of interacting with him. In some ways, everybody has their own Picasso. For me, Picasso is a master of imbibing a stroke with emotion that comes off the page or comes off the painting or comes off the ceramic. He was in a ceramic period when he created this.
Interesting.
And capturing the viewer and having them feel the emotion, even in his abstraction. And because of my background in kind of late medieval studies, to me, the graphic impulse, particularly in this work, strikes me as being very similar to the graphic impulse that was used in late 15th century, often Northern European work, which broadly referred to as blood piety. And it's a tendency for medieval manuscripts to have a kind of roughness, and very similar to the strokes that Picasso is using. And it's a way of communicating to the viewer, a way of helping them to identify with the suffering, both physical and emotional suffering, of a very human Christ. So it is a part of a devotional practice. And we have a little manuscript here.
Oh my.
As an example.
Quite a contrast.
It is in size. And so this is the kind of manuscript that you hold and you take with you, and it emphasizes a more personal way of interacting with the material. And so we have this little book, and you can see the dots and the lines in red that are drawn over.
Yes.
In a way of helping the viewer to identify with the suffering of Christ in this case. And I think it's the parallels. You can't call it a historical precedent. There is absolutely no reason why Picasso would have interacted with this kind of devotional literature very heavily, but the graphic impulse of the artists in that period seem very similar to Picasso, and both are responding to suffering.
Absolutely.
Reverdy's poems are filled with the suffering that he experienced and that he knew others experienced during World War II. And the 15th century was also full of turmoil. And so I think one of the successes of this modern manuscript format, especially in the way that Picasso and Reverdy are able to come together in this collaboration, is that because they're using these kind of abstract methods of communicating to the audience, I can take my educational background, find a parallel that then helps me to enter a conversation that they're having. So between the images and between the words, I have something to bring to that relationship. And I can't help, I wish I could go back in time and ask Thierry if that's what he was hoping to do. But if it is, then certainly Song of the Dead realized it.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful interpretation. Thank you. Mariana, thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a fascinating exploration of the old and new and how they can come together to enlighten a little bit of both. So I really appreciate your knowledge and your expertise here, and we will definitely come together again to talk about more manuscripts, to talk about more livres d'artistes. And I want to thank you for joining us for another segment of From the Vaults. We look forward to seeing you next time.